to hide away.
I gotta tell you, it's hard to explain to your kids why you are frantically looking for your socks in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, why you are running to your car with your sneakers in your hand, why you are speeding off down the street to get to the hospital. I got home later that day, and guess what I was greeted by? A nice little note taped to the front door of my house that a neighbor had put there, commenting on my rate of speed of departure. And comment, a love note. And I remember that I sat down at the table, at the kitchen table, to read this note, and I noticed that I had blood all over my sneakers. And it was the blood from the patient whose life I had just saved. And that the blood had actually soaked through my sneakers and onto my socks. I gotta tell you, my socks, my sneakers, my rate of speed, all of that is immaterial to me, as long as no one gets hurt. And yet, the no one that I'm most afraid of hurting are my children. Now, my husband is a liver transplant surgeon, and I am a heart transplant surgeon, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking slacker couple. Bunch of underachievers. But actually, you know, we get along great. I mean, we really, now that I think about it, we really don't argue about a lot. I mean, the only thing we ever really argue about is which is the better organ, the heart or the liver. right? And, you know, I always tell them, look, if you can friggin' buy the organ in a store and eat it, how big could it possibly be? Anyway, I always figure. So you can imagine that with two surgeons, you know, our lives are just this one big head-on collision between the lives that we lead at the hospital and the lives that we have at home. And yet, I know there are a lot of working couples, a lot of working parents who really keep that separate. You know, they keep their work life on one burner and they keep their home life on another, and the two never meet. But for my husband and I, that's just impossible. So out of the profound love that we have for our children, we've decided to really incorporate them in what we do each day. We make them a part of it so they don't feel so much like a victim of our jobs when we're, you know, tearing off on a Sunday afternoon. And the way that I have chosen to actually involve my kids is that I bring them to the hospital with me on rounds, on weekends. And, you know, it's always Mother's Day weekend, of course, because I'm always on call on Mother's Day weekend. And I frankly wish they had a weekend or a holiday called Working Mother's Day. Maybe I'd get that one off. But anyway, I love to bring him to the hospital. So Gabriel, who's 4, he doesn't really want to see the patients. He just wants to see the bones, you know? So, but anyway, so what I do with Gabriel is I bring him up to the intensive care unit and I just stick him in front of an x-ray machine and let him look at chest x-rays to his heart's content. And then I let the nurses, you know, ply him full of Jell-O and graham crackers and juice until he's just spinning with sugar, and he's totally fine. But Nicholas, who's a little bit older, Nicholas is 6, and he actually wants to see the patients. So he'll go with me to the intensive care unit into the patients' rooms. And what is so amazing to me is that this kid will go into a room with a patient who's got 9 different tubes and hoses going into and out of their body, on a ventilator, in a coma. He'll walk right up to that patient, touch their hand, and say, "Hope you feel better." That's something, hope you feel better. And then he'll turn to me and just beam as if he's cured the patient. But I think the beauty of that is that a child believes that just a touch or a kind word is enough to heal a patient. I suppose that's why he started drawing healing robots. It's a great story. You know, one day he asked me, "Mommy, who is your sickest patient?" And I told him, well, it's a patient named Richard. So he drew this robot and he gave it to me and he said, "Well, Mommy, this is a healing robot, and I want you to take this robot and put it in Richard's room and he'll get better." So I did. And Richard got better. And it was incredible. And I gotta tell you, sometimes I feel like that. You know, as a heart surgeon, there's a lot of patients I can't help with my skill set. And sometimes I feel like a healing robot, you know, like just a two-dimensional piece of paper stuck on a wall, not doing anything medically or surgically to help my patients, but hoping that just by being there, that in some way I'm healing them. So this healing robot thing went on for a while. And one day he said, well, Mommy, who's your sickest patient today? And I said, well, Nicholas, today my sickest patient is a really nice woman named Kimberly. And you know what? Kimberly has a son just like you, except he's a little bit older. And you know what he does? He sleeps in his mommy's room at the hospital every night because he loves her so much. Unbelievable. So I want to just tell you for a second a little bit about Kim. She was just an incredible lady. She was a woman who was a professional comedian, so she had this great sense of humor about her illness. She was also someone who actually carried a torch in the 1984 Winter Olympics, so she was just a solid woman. She had metastatic breast cancer that had actually traveled to her heart, and it had created this layer of fluid around her heart that was pressing on it. And I had taken her to surgery to drain that fluid and left a small catheter in place. Unfortunately, she couldn't go home with that catheter in place, and that catheter really tethered her to the hospital. It kept her there, where she couldn't go home. She couldn't go home to die. The other thing about Kim was she was so concerned about everyone else around her and had such little concern about her own well-being. And I know this because when I was making rounds on her, I had this lousy cold, and you know, every day she'd ask me about my cold, how am I feeling? And I'm like, you know, I have a cold, you have metastatic breast cancer. And yet she was always so concerned about me, and I thought that was really unbelievable. So one day I go in to see how Kim is doing, and I gotta tell you, she really wasn't doing very well. She was sort of sitting in a chair and kind of hunched forward, and she was taking these agonal kind of breaths, and she couldn't get her breath, and she was just sweating profusely, and her dark hair was just so matted against her face. And you know, she looked up at me, and when I walked in the room, and said, how are you feeling today? And I said, how am I feeling today? I'm feeling like we should go to the intensive care unit. That's how I'm feeling today. And that's where off we went. That's where we went. I packed her up, packed her things, brought her up to intensive care. And that's the day that she officially became my sickest patient. So when Nicholas asked about my sickest patient, I told him it was Kimberly. So Nicholas drew Kimberly a picture, except he didn't draw one of the healing robots, he drew her a rainbow. And I asked him about it. I said, Nicholas, you know, why did you draw Kimberly the rainbow and not a healing robot? And he said, well, Mommy, Kimberly needs to go over that rainbow so she can get better. I thought that was so profound because, you know, Nicholas didn't know anything about Kimberly. He just knew that she was my sickest patient. So the next day, rainbow in one hand and scotch tape in the other, off I went to see Kimberly in intensive care. The oddest thing was that when I got there, despite the fact that it was just a beautiful, sunny Southern California afternoon, no light penetrated her room. It was just dark in there. And in her room was a cot next to her bed, and on it was her son, where he always was. This kid was maybe 20, 22 years old, kind of a big, husky kid, and there he was on the cot, lying there with a set of headphones on, and just sleeping next to his mom. And he was breathing that sort of gentle, paced, quiet breath of someone who's in a deep sleep. Contrasted to that was his mom, who was lying there in a rumpled up hospital bed. Maybe she weighed, I don't know, maybe she weighed 90 pounds. And she was breathing those sharp, agonal breaths. When I walked into a room, she opened one eye, and I said, you know, that I had this rainbow that Nicholas had drawn, and I wanted to just, you know, to put it in her room for her. But she didn't hear me. She didn't really acknowledge me. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. What mattered was that I hung the rainbow at eye level so that if she opened her eyes again, you know, she'd see it. But she never did. And just as I taped it to the wall, her son woke up. You know, he didn't really wake up. He was kind of half awake and half asleep, and he got up and he sort of poured himself into the chair next to her bed. And he did it in this way that was sort of mechanical and kind of fluid, and it was so routine that it was almost like he'd done this 1,000 times, and you know, maybe he had just got up every day and sat next to his mom. Now the railing of the bed was up on that side, and you know, he was sitting there in the chair and he's trying to kind of get his arm over the railing to kind of be close to his mom. And that's when I finally spoke to him, and I said, "Do you want to get in bed with your mom?" And he was startled because I think he didn't even realize it was in the room, and he said, "Is that possible?" And I told him that anything is possible. So I got a nurse to help me move his mother very, very carefully to one side of the bed so that I could make room for him. I told you he's a big guy. And then this big kid gently, and I mean ever so gently, just got in bed with his mom and laid down next to her. And I put the railing up on his side, and I turned off all the monitors so that there was no more beeping and no more blinking lights, that it was quiet. And then he did something that was so beautiful. He cuddled his mom. He put his arm around his mom so her head was right here, and he just cuddled her. You know, like the way I cuddle my kids when they crawl in bed with me at night, the way you cuddle your children. It was incredible. 3 minutes later, she died. Just like that. Like blowing out a candle. And it was as if she waited for him. That she waited for him to get in bed and hold her so she could leave this earth. When it's my turn to die, that's how I want to die. I want to die in the arms of my son. When I got home later that day, you know, Nicholas, he asked me how Kim liked the rainbow. And I told him that Kim loved the rainbow very much. And you know what she did? She went over that rainbow, Nicholas, and she's feeling much, much better now. So I say to you, working parents, because I know you're out there, please involve your kids in what you do each day at work. Involve them in what you do, because maybe, just maybe, they won't feel so far away from you when you're at work being a healing robot.